Sitting here with my cup of warm coffee, stoking the fire, setting out some chairs as I wait for your arrival, the arrival of good friends and good company, as we bask once again in the throes of cozy horror. So, welcome to Cozy Horror, with me, Dr. Plague. I've got 5 great stories from yours truly, and equally as skilled writers, I'm sure. So, let's get right to it and see what we've got in store for you today. Today's cozy horror theme is going to be horror in the woods, something we have quite a bit of experience with. So, without further ado, let's get down to it. Coming to you first from Deliriation, I hope I'm spelling that right, is a story about a strange camping trip in a part of the woods that might be best avoided, especially if you don't want any questions about odd stains on your tent. So, let's take a trip to a forest where the deer cry blood. I'd been a hunter for most of my life leading up to this incident. The smell of the warm air and the beauty of nature always had me at ease. I never felt scared alone at night in the woods because I had seen everything there is to be scared of. I've seen bears the size of small cars, animals so vicious that they'll kill anything that moves. The one thing I was never scared of was deer. I'd heard the tales of skinwalkers and wendigos and pretty much anything in between. My uncle was an expert on tracking and hunting. We always went on trips together and would always come back with a fresh kill. He did have a rule, though. I remember it so vividly because it was weird. He never wanted to go hunting in winter. I never asked why. I don't know, but something about it always had me on edge. One day during winter, I was about to go deer hunting when my uncle stopped me at the front door. When he came in, he saw my packed supplies and my rifle and knew I was about to go hunting. He immediately burst into a wrath of anger and dragged me to the wall to get into my face. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" he said, spittle flying all over my face as he looked at me crazy. He looked primal, as if he was fearful of something that he didn't want to share. It's the same face you would expect a child to make if he was dumped in the middle of nowhere. The face of fear you see in people who have PTSD. I calmly brushed him off and got to the door saying I was going hunting. I was not about to fight with my uncle and ruin the trip, as I hadn't gone hunting for close to a month. When you hunt, you get adjusted to it, and when you go on break, you kind of miss it. As I got in my truck, my uncle peered at me out the window. He was there to take care of my house, but before I reversed, he left with the door open. My uncle's prone to outburst. As I should mention, he's only ever done it a few times, and it's always in a situation where the reaction suits it. Not this one, though. This one was bad, and I wondered what was so bad about hunting in the winter. The spot I'd planned was an isolated one. It was a very heavily forested area, which I hadn't been to before. I obviously had mapped the area out and brought essential survival tools in case the worst came, but I never thought I'd have to use it after all those years out in the woods. When I arrived, the crisp cold air immediately saturated me in discomfort. I quickly got another layer of clothes on before I started to walk to where I would set up camp for the night. The clearing I had chosen was a pretty tight one. There was a big tree in the center that stood tall above the rest. It was called the Forest Star, which suited it. Around the clearing, the forest was extremely dense. Almost no sun shone through the top. There was a small hunting tower north of the entrance of the clearing, so it was a direct walk from the camp. As I walked ahead, I noticed something. There were very small droplets of blood littering the ground. My first thought was that it must be from an injured animal or something, but the droplets were small and evenly placed. I shook the thought out of my head and made it to my setup as I started to pin my tent. When I was done, I checked my watch. It was about 5:30 p.m. I had about 2 hours for hunting before it was pitch black, so I made it to the tower. When I undid my rifle from the case, I heard scraping. Shaking it off, I took position and waited. As I stood there, time almost seemed to slow down. I was in a precise focus. I was ready for anything. I wasn't ready for what I saw, though. Out came 2 bucks that seemed injured. There were small droplets of blood coming from their eyes. As I focused in, I saw that it wasn't dried blood either. It was fresh, and it was oozing from their eyes. I was shocked. I'd never seen anything like it. Multiple scenarios ran through my head. Had a hunter shot both of them in the eye and managed not to kill them? But each scenario seemed more unlikely than the last. I took aim at the closest one and shot it. It stood there for a second, just not moving. Then they trotted off as if nothing had happened. Blood was running from the wound, so I'd obviously hit it, but it didn't seem scared or fazed. I decided that was enough and sort of jogged to my site. I was freaking out and decided that I'd cook dinner and go to bed early. When I got back to camp, I pulled out a tin of beans, grabbed a pot, and started a fire so I could cook them. As I cracked open a beer, the familiar sound of a branch snapping sounded off next to me. I brushed it off as I sat back to relax, thinking it was probably a small deer. I was thinking about the deer as I started to chalk it up to the fact that I must not have hit deep, and the deer was in shock. When I finished eating, I went to bed. I was shivering in the night cold, and I could hear my body shaking uncontrollably. As I dozed off after a brutal 2 hours of cold, I heard another snap. This time, it was a lot louder, though, like a bear. I immediately grabbed my rifle and got out of the tent. My fire was burning low, and in the distance, I saw 2 red lights. I walked towards them when my mind started to race. Something felt wrong. As I closed the distance, my guts were literally twisted. My mind was anxious, and I felt like I was about to break down. Then I realized what was wrong. Those weren't lights. They were 2 big, beady, solid red eyes. There were no pupils. They were just orbs hovering. I stood frozen in realization. I thought it was a big cat, but what emerged was much worse. Its fur was black, darker than the night around us. Its antlers grew twisted and uneven, but the worst part was it was crying blood. Deep red droplets were pelting down its unnatural face. I couldn't make a sound. I was frozen in fear. Then it made a sound like a baby crying. It was horrible. The sound of unnatural wails filled the cold air, making it worse. My body felt crumpled, so I finally broke out into a sprint. When I looked back, it was still there. It wasn't even breathing, but the sound of that baby crying wasn't fading. It was like a speaker was attached to my ear. When I made it to the camp, I rushed to pack my stuff. In a hurry, I ran, leaving the tent behind, and rushed onto my truck. As I fumbled with the keys, I saw that something was walking slowly towards me. That's when the whispering started. Terrible, faint voices echoed throughout the forest as my mind started to close. I felt my cerebral melting as I sat there in a kind of sleep paralysis. I found the strength to finally open the door and get in my car. I slammed it shut, and that thing was right at the window. I started to sob as I jammed the key in the ignition. My mind felt fried, and I swerved out of there. I didn't care if I hit anything. I just wanted to be away from that thing. Before I could properly back out, it stood on its legs, and it repeated a voice I recognized. You do not escape this. The forests are mine. It was my grandpa's voice. He died when I was 6, and I never knew any of the details. The thing then made a howl, a terrible shrieking howl that hurt my entire body. As it did so, I heard scampering as more of those things came out. They had blood running from their eyes as well. The baby cries started again, and that's when I finally drove out of that place. When I raced home, I immediately barged into my door. My shoulder ached, but I didn't care. I shoved the door and locked it and ran into the kitchen. That's when I saw my uncle sitting at the table, enjoying a glass of scotch. So, you saw what I did, didn't you, Anthony? I couldn't form words. I was so shocked. My uncle came up to me and put a hand on my shoulder. What you saw out there is my rule I abide by. There are things in those forests in winter that are so horrible even the most seasoned can't handle it. I saw it when I was a boy, and since then I don't hunt during the winter. I finally mustered a sentence. What was it? He took a deep breath before sitting down. You saw something called the Urabarak. It's an ancient being that dwells in the forest during these winters. Hunters who see it usually are never the same again, but some never come back home. I was lucky. My uncle sort of sniffed as he told me about his encounter with the Urabarak. When I was 23, my father and I went out into the woods on a very cold winter to hunt. Our family was struggling, so we didn't have much food. When we were hunting, my dad called out to me, but before I could even get to him, I heard him yell out before he went silent. I never saw him again, but what stood there was worse than the loss of my own. A deer with red eyes, black fur, and twisted antlers stood there. Blood ran from its eyes. Then it started to cry like a baby. My uncle broke down and had to take a few seconds before continuing. I comforted him as I was teary-eyed too. It ran after me, Anthony, on two legs. It was like a human, and I rushed to get away from it. But I wasn't quick enough. He rolled up his sleeve and revealed a terrible red scar that ran across the entire underside of his arm. It was trying to feast on me. It knew I feared it, but eventually I managed to lose it. He finally finished his scotch before continuing. I was stuck in those woods for 3 days, fighting to survive. I heard its cries and whispers all around as I tried to make it out. I finally arrived at the road and was taken in by police. No trace was ever found of my dad, except for one thing. They found blood at the scene and tested it. It was my father's. What was strange about it is it was mixed with his tears. My uncle finally stood up. Fear it, for it knows who you are. Those were his last words. He left my house, and the police found him wrapped up in a noose 2 days later. It broke me. My hunting buddy and best friend was gone. There was one detail about his suicide that was never resolved. He had droplets of blood coming from his eyes. The coroner inspected it and said it had been an aneurysm, but I'm not so sure that's the truth. I'm 50 now, and I haven't been hunting in 2 decades. I can't even go into the forest anymore. I'm thinking about going back and seeing what Urabarak is. Maybe I can kill him. Beware the Urabarak, for he lurks in the cold. It's always interesting when the most dangerous thing in the woods aren't the predators, but the prey. This next one comes to us from yours truly, Dr. Plague himself, and it talks about a frequent subject of woods-based horror, but I won't spoil anything here. Let's hear a story about one night spent in the woods.
Good evening, my little creeperonies. It's me, Dr. Plague. Sorry to butt in at the start of the story, but I thought I'd tell you that tonight's story is going to be a bit of a two-parter. You see, the story I wrote after this one is kind of a sequel to a story that never quite made it on this channel. So I thought I'd let you know that it's probably going to be a little bit longer. So, if you need to go make yourself a drink, a sandwich, maybe sit down with one of my books, before you listen, get yourself ready. That would be fantastic. Might I suggest my latest book, Dark Journeys, which is now available on Amazon. There's a link below if you'd like to come check it out. And now, on to tonight's story. I was drinking with some friends a few nights ago, swapping stories from old times, when my old roommate reminded me of these guys I used to hang out with. Or, as he put it, that time you hung out with those crazy pagans out in the woods. The crazy pagans in question were a coven I crossed paths with while living in North Georgia. No one tells you, when you move here, that there are a lot of non-Christian communes in the North Georgia hills, and given my interests, I ran into a lot of them. I've met pagans, druids, Wiccans, and many other practitioners of strange and foreign beliefs. Most are just hobbyists, people with a passing interest who find the mystic section of Barnes & Noble and go a little nuts. However, some of these guys take this stuff very seriously, and sometimes they take it a little too far. This story is about one of those groups. I had taken a semester of religious studies, and it had led me down a rabbit hole that had led me to a general interest in occult and mysticism. This led to a lot of brooding in the back of my college library, reading over old books, and making notes on strange subjects and odd topics. I had taken an interest in runes, and that was how I met Patrick, or Wormwood as he was calling himself in those days. He was teaching me about runes in exchange for some notes I'd made on energy exchange. We became friends and started hanging out a bit at a coffee shop in Dahlonega that catered to our sort of crowd. That was how I met Amadeus. Now, as enamored as I was with the idea of mysticism, Amadeus was still a little weird. I arrived to meet with Patrick one day to find a man in his mid-40s sitting next to him. His gray hair was braided down his back, his bald crown was oiled and gleaming, and he wore an honest-to-God traveling cloak, not one of those Hot Topic long coats that his crowd usually wore. His shirt was obscured with silver charms hung on long leather thongs about his neck, and he stared at me as he sat, fingers steepled across his eyes in a decidedly wizard fashion. He began following very probing questions at me before Patrick could make introductions. He wanted to know what I knew about everything from runes to tarot to demonology to herbcraft and everything in between. I was studied in quite a few subjects and was happy to flex my knowledge for him, so we spent about an hour talking shop. If I'd known what he wanted, I'd have left right then. He must have been impressed with what I had to say. "You seem pretty knowledgeable. It appears that Wormwood did not exaggerate your abilities. I'm looking for someone to come into the woods with us for a gathering. I need someone capable of setting up and maintaining a protective circle around our campsite, and to act as a guide while we await the spirits. I'm willing to pay if you're willing to come out for the weekend." We talked a little bit about what was expected, and we came to an arrangement. I would set up his protective circle, provide scholarly advice, and keep them from wandering off into the woods in the event that something took notice of our gathering. This would be a standard gathering for them, some 30-odd members of their coven coming together, and Amadeus was pretty clear that this was likely to get rowdy. He would give me $250 today, and another $250 at the end of the weekend. As a poor college student, it sounded pretty good to me. I had done similar things before, setting up circles and safeguarding people. Sounded like an easy $500 at the time. I took his money and set about getting a few things together for that weekend. I'd need a few things to pull this off, but honestly, I wasn't expecting much more than some drinking in the woods and a bit of babysitting. By Friday, I had assembled my components and made my way to the agreed-upon spot. They had decided not to use an established campground, but instead had decided to camp in a section of the wood they claimed to have heard about from someone in our circle. I arrived to find about 6 other vehicles down an access road, most of them old vans. Just as I was wandering off into the woods, however, one of the doors slid open and out popped a short blonde woman in a homemade dress. I say short, but she was probably about 5'2", with a long spill of silver blonde hair. She asked my name, and I told her, and she told me hers was Andromeda, but I could call her Angie. She was going to be my guide for the weekend. Amadeus said I should keep an eye out for you. I'm to assist you in anything you might need this weekend. That should have been a huge red flag, but I kind of shrugged it off at the time. Angie led the way, and we walked about a mile into the woods. She chattered all the way about how much she had been looking forward to this weekend, She said that Amadeus had been researching this area and thought that it was a good spot for communing with spirits. The area was reputed for sightings, and the coven was hopeful they could make contact with whatever lived in these woods. They kept saying coven, but as the campsite came into view, I was beginning to wonder if cult wasn't a better word. The clearing was a circle, 30 feet wide, with about 12 tents set up inside. The forest loomed around the campsite, and the old forest seemed to resent having a section of itself gouged out so people could camp. At the center of the tents was a fire pit, a big one, with a lot of styrofoam coolers sitting around it. I could see people bustling about the campsite, making adjustments to tents and setting up sleeping bags. Angie led me to the fire pit where Amadeus was reading a book and smoking what smelled like a joint. He looked at my duffel bag and asked if I'd brought enough supplies to put a circle around the whole campsite. I told him I had, but I was already doing the math and realizing the sage I had brought would go quickly. He nodded and told me there were supplies in his tent if I needed them. He told me also that Angie was going to work with me this weekend. "Use her in any capacity you see fit," he said, and a lecherous grin spread across his face that was hard to miss. That was red flag number 2. Seeing as most of his coven members were women, I was beginning to get a pretty good idea about what sort of setup I had stumbled across. I felt a little squeamy about it, but if they were comfortable with it, then who was I to judge? I had already decided what capacity I would use Angie in this weekend, and whatever ideas Amadeus had didn't figure into them. I wasn't opposed to sleeping with women I'd just met, but the idea of sleeping with someone who might not be 100% on board with it was a non-starter for me. I told him I needed to set up my tent, but it was quickly whisked away by a pair of women in homespun dresses, who started setting it up near Amadeus's large, ornate tent. So instead, Angie and I set about setting up the protective circle. I won't bore you with the details. My process probably wouldn't work for you anyway. We set about digging a small trench around the campsite and filled it with items I would use to seal the circle. If this sounds dumb to you, it sounds pretty dumb to me, too. When I look back on it through the lens of time, I realize I was no less deluded than the rest of them. But that kind of code of silence with these communities is pretty common. Even if you think someone is full of shit, you keep your mouth shut, because you don't want them to call you on your bullshit. If you're lucky, you grow out of it. If you're not, you become like Amadeus and his little harem. Hopefully not literally, though. By the time we finished, I was sweaty and ready to settle down for the night. Angie had been a pretty big help, and as we talked, I learned that she'd been with the community for about 7 years. One of the women, whose hair was very similar to Angie's, kept bringing us water, and I started to suspect that she might be Angie's mom. We set up the ingredients, and as we finished, I instructed her to start lighting the sage bundles. I had placed them every few feet. Once they were smoking, I lit the sticks and leaves that I had put in there too, and hoped they would create a smoldering circle that would last until morning. When we stepped back inside, I spoke some pseudo-Latin, made some more vaguely mystic hand gestures, and declared the circle closed. That seemed to be enough for the coven, and they began to set up around the fire pit. The coolers, as it turned out, were full of beer. The women brought out a large pot full of soup makings and set it on a hanger over the fire. Amadeus brought out a trunk from his tent, and I saw him pass out baggies of what I assumed were drugs. Mushrooms seemed to be the drug of choice, but there were a lot of people lighting pipes, and more than one person I saw snorting something off the back of their hand. A group of young men were listening to Amadeus wax philosophical, and he leaned over to let me know that my secondary duties for the evening were about to begin. I sighed. I guess I was on guide duty then. I'd played the guide before at gatherings like this, and it was rarely fun once people started using drugs and getting drunk. I guess designated adult sounds less fun than guide, but that was essentially what I was there to do. My job was to make sure that no one wandered off into the woods, no one slept on their back and drowned in their own vomit, and no one tried to jump into the fire. Amadeus and his flock drank heavily and used heartily, but I was surprised at how tame the gathering was. Amadeus and about 5 or 6 young men were pretty much waited on hand and foot by the 24 women, and Angie seemed to think it was her job to do the same for me. I had soup when I wanted it, despite me telling her I could get it myself. She also intercepted anyone who tried to offer me a beer or a drug and kept a bottle of water close at my hand. She helped me with the 2 or 3 times I needed to help someone from tripping over the circle, and she was a delight to talk with. She was knowledgeable about a lot of the things that I was interested in, and I found myself having a good time, despite being an outsider in what was likely a cult gathering. I was just about to make a Kool-Aid joke when the soup pot was taken away, and 3 women carried out a heavy iron vessel that they hung in its place. It was ugly and ill-made, not the beautiful thing you usually think of for these sorts of things. It looked like a big teapot, so much as anything, and the women started shoving bundles of herbs into the top of it. I had no idea what kind of herbs they were, and when I asked, Amadeus, he just winked and tittered. I told him if they were planning to flood the campsite with smoke, I wouldn't be able to guide them if I was under the influence of whatever he was putting in that pot. He snorted. "These herbs are not for us. This is smoke to entice the spirits." He called everyone close and set them around the fire as the kettle began to heat up and the smoke started creeping out. "Good evening, my children. The meal has been eaten and the circle has been set by our most generous guide." What followed was a scattering of applause, and I nodded half-heartedly. "Now, for the reason we are all here. The smoke will attract the spirits that dwell in this forest, and we will be free to view them from a safe distance as they are unable to cross our barrier." The smoke had begun to increase a bit, and I could see it making its way up the spout and across the campsite. It smelled terrible, like burning syrup, but it didn't seem to be having much of an effect on anyone. Most of them were already tripping on mushrooms or any number of other things, and the smoke did little more than make them wrinkle their noses. As it began to bellow out, the herbs catching fire, Amadeus continued to talk about philosophy and magic and a good number of other things. His followers sat dutifully, hanging on his every word, and I tried to be polite as I checked my phone to see if I had any service. To no one's surprise, I had no bars, so I put it away and tried to act interested in Amadeus's impromptu TED Talk. As I listened, though, I started hearing noises in the woods. The smoke was pretty thick by then, Amadeus giving his dissertation in a fog bank, and I started hearing noises. I mentioned this to Amadeus, and he got pretty excited. He instructed his followers to start chanting. He took it up first, and they started copying him in a shaky, undulating tone. I got up and went to the edge of the circle, kind of figuring the smoke had upset some of the natural wildlife, and I wanted to see what we had attracted the attention of. It was midsummer, and the idea that we had pissed off a bear or a small group of coyotes or feral dogs was not outside the realm of possibility. I stood at the edge of the circle, not wanting to break it and mess up whatever protective magic I had going on, and I squinted out into the dark woods. Now, if you've never been camping out in the real woods, the first thing you come to realize is that it's really dark out there. I know that sounds obvious, but it's a different kind of dark than the normal city dark. The woods really only have to deal with the intrusion of the moon at night, and with the campfire starting to come down off its normal roar, it was pretty dark outside the circle I had made. I squinted and looked, but honestly, a bear could have swiped my face off before I saw him. I could hear something crunching around out there, something that sounded big. I returned to the fire, the flock still chanting and undulating, and I could hear the crunching noises coming from several points at once. "He has heard our call!" Amadeus rejoiced. That was when the trees started shaking. Out in the woods, I could see the shadows of trees being shaken and pushed violently. Limbs were snapped all over the place, and as they shook, there was an underlying sound accompanying it. Something was scraping the tree bark, peeling it away angrily as whatever it was, whatever they were, kept battering the trees around the campsite. I say they, because it wasn't just one tree that was shaking. It was 2, then 3, then 7, and before long, it seemed like the whole forest was trying to get up and leave. Above the sound of shaking trees and snapping limbs, I could hear animal sounds too. I could hear dogs and cats and birds, the grunt of deer, the growl of a bear, the snort of horses, and all of it around the campsite. I've been present for some weird stuff that makes me feel pretty secure in the belief that something was out there. But this was different. This was downright terrifying. The flock, however, was in ecstasy. This is apparently what they had wanted, what they had been waiting for, and they quickly moved to the edge of the circle so they could see what was out there. I, however, went back to my tent to get something out of my duffel bag. I was kind of done with this. The magic had gotten pretty real pretty quick, and I wanted to see what exactly was out there. I still figured our smoke had pissed off a herd of deer or maybe a wild dog pack, maybe even a bear, and I didn't want to suddenly become dinner for something big and angry. I had packed a deer spotting light that my dad had given me for Christmas, and I wanted to know right now what was out there making all that racket. When I came out with it, I lit up a big section of woods and started hunting. One of the boys that had been sitting with Amadeus slapped it out of my hand after about 20 seconds. But honestly, that was about 15 seconds longer than I needed. When the light fell on a deer, I almost breathed a sigh of relief. Well, not a deer. Not really. It had antlers, so I guessed it was actually a buck. The antlers, however, were long. The tines sort of wound together like vines. It was up on its hind legs, scraping its hooves against the tree in a way that I thought was kind of strange for a deer. I had heard of young bucks rubbing their antlers against the trees, mostly to get the velvet off or to scratch an itch, but I had never heard of them rubbing their hooves against the tree. When it turned its head to look at me, its eyes glowed like a dog's in a camera flash. When it turned its head, I could see that half of the velvety skin was torn, showing the muscles of its face and the bone beneath. I took all this in before the light was slapped out of my hand, and I backed away from the circle, suddenly wanting none of this. People were standing around the edges of the circle, and as I backed away, I saw someone step over the trench and walk into the woods. Others followed suit, stepping into the ditch and snuffing out the sage. This would create a hole in the circle. This would allow whatever that was to come into our campsite. In my mind, we were breached already, and this job had just become pretty dangerous. I am completely unashamed to say that I went to my tent, dug the padlock out, padlocked my tent from the inside, and stayed there until morning. As I pulled the sleeping bag up around me, I could hear people outside the tent. From the dancing fire pit, I could see the shadows of things in the campsite as well. Some of them were on 2 feet, but some of them were walking on 4 feet. Some of the people out there were laughing, others were crying, some were definitely screaming as they plunged into the dark woods. I shivered with fear till morning, and when the sun came up, I collected my things and got out. The campsite wasn't some sacrificial pit, though. I could see people lying around the campsite in various states of undress, and the area around the bonfire was trashed. Coolers were smashed, beer cans were stomped and torn, and vegetables and food packages were strewn everywhere. Of Amadeus, there was no sign. I never saw him again, and Patrick said no one had heard from him after that night. His coven dissipated after that, and I never heard from any of them ever again. I was never paid the other half of my fee, but I suppose that was fitting. I had failed to guide them, and the ritual had gone astray. All I know is I ran the mile back to my car and never looked back. I did a little research on my own when I got home. Turns out there have been a lot of weird happenings in those woods. People have reported seeing lights in the sky, hearing strange noises, hearing animals that aren't native to the region, and a feeling of overall dread felt by those who stay there overnight. People have gone missing in those woods, too, and authorities have never found a trace of them. I'm not going to sit here and claim that I had some kind of paranormal experience out there. I'm not going to tell you that I saw a skinwalker, or a wendigo, or an alien, or anything like that. I'm not going to tell you that I saw a ghost, or a cryptid, or any of that either. What likely happened was that Amadeus was burning some kind of psychotropic drugs in a kettle, and we all experienced some kind of group hallucination out there. These are the things that I saw, and these are the things that I told my friends as we sat drinking around our yearly bonfire that night. After I told them my story, more than a few of them moved inside. I guess maybe the dark outside the cabin was a little too dark for them now.
I always find that the best horror has a few tablespoons of truth to it. Did it happen exactly like that? Probably not. But it was an event that I can remember pretty clearly from my mid-20s. But I'll let you be the judge if I'm just, spouting off or not. Moving right along, we have another story about a strange forest dweller by Strange Accounts. So the next time you go camping, maybe look into the local legends before you pitch your tent. You wouldn't want to run afoul of something like Clickity clackety. I know it sounds silly, but has anyone ever heard this old poem about the Clickity clackety? I don't know if it's just something from my small town that they kept alive or what, but I've been trying to do some research about it for the last few weeks. I haven't come up with much, and I'm looking for help. Honestly, at this point, I'm really begging for someone who has some information on this thing to step forward. But this is the poem I'm talking about. In these woods there lives a puppet. It sits and watches all who pass, with eyes of coal and teeth of rust, with skin crackling and full of crust, with wiry limbs, brittle as spent glass. It moves with subtle creaks and cracks. So if you're ever in the woods and see a puppet sitting near, do not look at it, no matter your fear. Just pretend you're okay. That's truly all I can say. In these woods there lives a puppet. For some context, I live in the southern edge of Wisconsin. My family has always been pretty savvy when it comes to camping, and it was a big thing for my brother Paul and I growing up. We always had fun during family camping trips. But flash forward 20 years, and my parents have since passed on. There was a bad car accident, and the loss hit us unexpectedly. So, as a little remembrance trip, my brother and I had planned a final journey up into the woods that our family had frequented. It's up near the town of Clements, Wisconsin. It's where my family had always camped, but this time we were going in deeper into the woods, just to have a little extra privacy from the normal campground tenants. Plus, we were planning on getting a little drunk, so we didn't want any officers kicking us out. So, we made our plans. We were going to meet at 3 p.m. on Friday afternoon in the parking lot of the Clements Park campground, after which we'd head up north for a couple of hours. We'd found a decent spot in a clearing through Google Map, and we wanted to check it out. After all was said and done, the plan was to head back to our cars on Sunday afternoon. It was just a dumb, drunk, grieving kind of weekend getaway. We both wanted to talk things through, but neither of us could really be described as the going through armchair therapy sort of people. This is just how we handled things. But once Friday came around, things immediately went south. I'd parked my car in the run-down dirt lot of the Clements Park around 2:30. There were a few scattered cars of other campers littered around the dirt field, but nothing really of note. In a way, I'd felt relieved that I wouldn't have to exchange pleasantries with any old family friends. But although I didn't see any familiar people, I did see familiar faces. The trees that had stood tall since I was a kid still remained in their proper places. They held on rebelliously firm to their plots and were left untouched by time. If anything, they had appeared larger to me that day. They had loomed over me with an intensity that I hadn't felt in years. Either they had grown larger, or I had felt much smaller. With a deep breath, I took in the strong, nostalgic smell of the cypress and pine trees that filled the woods. It had always amazed me that the memory could be triggered so heavily with scent. The smell of fresh trees and dirt had taken me back to simpler times of life, when you entrusted your whole being to the care of others, when you were so little that your parents had seemed unstoppable by the forces of nature. You felt carefree because your parents could protect you. You never had to worry about yourself. Now that I was an adult, I knew that whole premise was faulty from the start. When death arrives, it arrives. It doesn't matter how much experience or wisdom you have. It has always, and will always, take what it wants. After a few minutes, I checked my phone and saw 2 unread text messages from Paul. He wrote that he was going to be a few hours late due to work, but told me to just go ahead without him. He said he'd meet me at the clearing sometime in the evening. I remember feeling disappointed in him. I know it wasn't his fault. He had a rough job. But this was supposed to be our time together. Our time to BS and get everything off our chest. I knew that, at the end of the day, there was nothing I could do about it. I just thought, whatever, and kept moving about with our plans. I walked behind my rusted little Honda Civic and popped open the trunk. What was inside my beaten-up sedan was worth more to me than my entire life's work. Right in front of me lay the same beaten-up rucksack that my dad had always taken with us. When he passed, my brother and I found all his camping gear still prepped and ready to go in the garage. At that point, we hadn't camped together for at least a decade. As a man, I held back tears as we found it. I think Paul had too. "Hey, Dad," I remembered saying as I picked up the heavy bag. "We're going on another trip together. Paul will be here soon." I looked towards the dirt path leading deeper into the woods and knew it was going to be one hell of a trek forward. It was pretty well known in our town that the trees in Clement's woods weren't exactly easy to travel through. There were thick patches of dry rotted tree limbs that had entangled and knotted around each other. One bad foot placement, and you'd end up snapping more than just tree limbs. With that in the back of my mind, I started my journey. The first thing you have to pass through is the standard campsites. They were full of beat-up trailers and half-assed tents. We called most of the trailers out there the regulars. They pretty much lived out there during the summer. They were good people, just a little odd. Once you got past most of them, you finally hit the start of Clement's Trail. It's less of a sanctioned path and more of a dusty foot trail. Years of fishermen coming and going had created a thin line of dirt that my family had enjoyed walking through for well over a decade. My brother and I walked down that exact path time and time again with our parents. It was basically a mile loop around a lake that happened to find itself surrounded by jack pines and red cedars that had made up the bulk of Clement's ecosystem. Past that was relatively untouched land. Now, was it legal for us to camp out past the sanctioned areas? Probably not. But what conservation officer would head several hours into the woods on a hunch there might be some buffoons grieving out there? So I pressed forward, continuing northward as I went into the depths of the tree line. Before I knew it, the Clements campground were out of sight and out of mind. During my hike, I used the sun as my marker and kept a good pace. I was actually a little ahead of schedule without having to keep pace with Paul. Incredibly, it was just over an hour of me walking due north that I started noticing something. There was this odd creaking noise coming from the distance just beyond me. It didn't sound like much of anything at first, just kind of like a tree cracking in the breeze. But when it kept happening, always the same distance away and always directly behind me, I started to get an odd feeling creeping up against the back of my mind. Yet every time I turned around to look at whatever was making that noise, I'd see the gentle swaying of green leaves overhead and the sand-colored trunks of the cedar trees, and nothing else. So every time I got that odd feeling running up my spine, I'd turn around and see nothing, then just keep marching on. This happened over and over again. It wasn't until I got to the clearing that something else popped into my head. I hadn't heard a single bird call that entire walk. Aside from the creaking of tree branches and the whistling of the wind, it had been dead quiet. But once again, I pushed it out of my mind. I shifted my focus to setting up the campsite for Paul and I. The clearing we had chosen was perfect. It actually looked better in person than it did on the overhead view from online. It was an almost perfect circle of grass, surrounded by a dense woodline. You could see the sun overhead, casting its dim glow from just over the top of the green canopy. I relaxed my mind a bit, now that I had gotten safely to our makeshift campsite. I went through the mental checklist of everything I had to prepare for the night. I started with the fire. I collected a few big stones that littered the forest floor and formed a little rock pit in the dead center of the clearing. Shortly after that, I made a big pile of dry firewood that I had found scattered around the ground. I did my best to fill the fire pit with the best wood I could find, and tried to spark the tinder with my dad's fire starter. The fire starter went off without a hitch, and it was just in time for the evening sun to start cresting over the horizon. Even though I felt a little rushed setting up the campsite on my own, there was something relaxing about focusing on a single task. I wished Paul was with me, but part of me needed some silence to sort out my own thoughts. The fire provided enough light for me to set up the three-man tent without issue. Before long, I was sitting by the fire, getting ready to open up the cooler and have a drink. That's when I finally got the text from my brother. "Hey, just FYI, I just got here. I'll be there in about 2 hours. I know a lot of you probably think hiking in the woods in the dark is stupid. You're right, we aren't the brightest tools in the shed, but we had an oversized ego for our capabilities. We'd been hiking and camping on our own for so long that it felt like second nature to us. I just texted him back with my thumbs up and fished out a drink. I sat my back against a broken cedar trunk near the fire and looked at my handiwork. "Here's to you, Mom and Dad," I muttered, before having a sip of my drink. Before I knew it, the cans had gathered next to me, and my eyes had gotten heavy. My eyes were half closed when I heard the same clinking noise I'd heard earlier. It was just outside the clearing, in the darkening woodline. My eyes drifted towards the edge of the trees and focused in on something directly across from me. There in the darkness of the sunless forest was a vague shape of something. It was barely noticeable in the shadows. It stood about 4 feet tall, and it was facing me. I slowly leaned myself forward off the tree trunk, my eyes fixated on the small, dark form. I was expecting it to turn and run away from me. It wouldn't have been the first time that I'd been spooked by a deer in the night. I thought to myself that any second now I'd hear the skittering of the deer hooves as they scampered back into the woods. But that's not what happened. As my eyes were focused on the little shape, it started to walk towards me. And by walk, I mean walk. Even with it being cast in shadow, I could tell that it had the frame of a small child. It was deathly thin and gaunt. It moved with a sense of weightlessness to it. The moment that it passed into the camp's clearing, the fire licked its face with light. Even through my drunken eyes, I could see what it was. It was the face of an old wooden marionette. I felt my heart lurch up in my throat. My body had instantly skipped the fight-or-flight response and went straight into freeze. I could no more lift a finger of my hand. All I could do was watch and examine the puppet's features. The wood was old and weathered, cracks and chips layering its pale skin. The eyes themselves were dark and empty, and the mouth was just a gaping hole full of rusted metal false teeth. It had what appeared to be human hair matted over its wooden scalp. It was just staring at me. Time passed, and it just kept staring. I worked up enough courage to slowly slide my hands towards my flashlight. I slowly aimed the bulb towards the thing at the edge of the camp and flipped the switch. Immediately, the puppet shot its hands up in the air and jittered its way towards me. Loud cracking and popping of aged wood filled the campsite. Its feet had glided its way over the forest floor as if it were floating, its knees bounding high up in the air with every mocking step. The clattering sound of wood on wood jangling in the empty void of darkness still haunts me. I dropped my flashlight and fell into the fetal position, completely curling up. My subconscious told me that I was already dead, and my body had totally given up in response. I counted the seconds in my head, waiting for whatever nightmare was about to befall me. But it didn't. I lay on the forest floor in a tight ball for God knows how many minutes. Eventually, I worked up the courage to take a glance at my tormentor. Through my fingers, I peered into my campsite, praying that the thing would be gone. But the puppet was still there. It was now halfway between the fire and me. The wind was blowing against its hardened skin, creaking its body ever so slightly with every gentle gust. Out of its mouth came a light clicking noise, almost like an infestation of woodworms, all calling out. "What do I do?" I remember repeating in my head. "What do I do?" Then I remembered the poem from when I was a kid. I remembered what it said. Just pretend you're okay. So I slowly sat up and kept the puppet in my peripheral vision. It turned to face me, but I did my best not to pay attention. "You're at camp. Act like you're at camp," I silently recited to myself. I noticed that the fires of the fire pit had begun to dim. I needed to stock the pit again before The light went out completely. I looked over to the large stock of dry wood I'd collected earlier. I thanked God that I'd been smart enough to make a pile before sitting down for the night. The timber couldn't have been more than 10 feet away from me, but when I went to take a step towards the dry wood, my legs nearly gave out from under me. I was shaking bad. I heard the puppet begin to creak its way back up behind me. Maybe it noticed my fear. Maybe it knew I wasn't acting right. My intuition was flaring up in my mind like red-hot coals, that this thing wasn't just something I could run from. I had to play the game. Get the firewood. Don't acknowledge it. Just get the firewood. I straightened myself up and walked as casually as I could over to the bundle of fallen tree branches and limbs. I picked up a large handful and turned around. The marionette was standing just behind me, its coal-black eyes looking at my face. The clicking noise that was escaping its mouth sent a nearly uncontrollable fear through my body. But I pressed on. I walked in a straight line towards the fire pit, narrowly missing the wooden body of the doll. I took a knee to be near the warm flames and dropped the wood down next to me. Handful by handful, I placed the branches in the pit. The creaking of the doll had made its way over to my side as I stoked the flames. I glanced down at my thigh as the doll placed its thin, rotten hand against me. At that moment, I wanted to jump up and run away as far and as fast as I could, but instead I ignored that feeling. I ignored it as the tears welled up in my eyes. I took a stand near the fire and gathered my strength. I closed my eyes and took one last breath of night air before walking over to the tent. As soon as I walked into it, I zipped the door closed behind me. I saw the silhouette of the puppet standing right on the other side of the plastic sheeting, illuminated by the fire behind it. I finally cried. In hushed tones, I cried as long as I could remember. I went to look at my cell phone, let my brother know not to come down there, to tell him to go back to his car and get the conservation officer out here as soon as he could. But when I reached for my pocket, it hit me. I'd left my phone outside near the broken tree stump. I glanced back out at the shadow just outside my tent. It was facing me. It felt like it could see me through the thin layer of fabric that lay between us. I tried to gather up my courage to walk outside my tent and grab the phone, but I couldn't. I just sat there in my tent until I heard footsteps walking up to the campsite. "Hey, Jules, you up?" I stayed silent as Paul called out to me. "Sorry I'm late, but..." "What the hell is that?" he gasped. I heard the panic in Paul's voice. I watched the shadow as the puppet turned to face him. Its arms and legs jerked violently in the air. Paul turned as fast as he could and ran out of the clearing. The puppet followed him with impossible speed. It glided, its dangling, flailing limbs in the air as it began its chase. Not even a minute later, I heard a horrified yelp, then complete silence. I stayed in the tent all night, numb, broken, defeated. I just continually asked myself why I didn't say anything, why I didn't do anything. By the time morning came, I had left camp, picking up my phone and trying to dial Paul over and over again. There was never an answer. I left everything I brought in that exact spot. I never went back for it. I left those woods in a half daze that I've never recovered from. Before I knew it, I was back in the campground. I contacted the officers in charge of the area, and they conducted a search. They refused to listen to anything I had to say about what I'd seen. But the thing is, they didn't just dismiss it like I was crazy. It was like they'd already known what had happened and had refused to acknowledge it. We never found my brother. I could never take another walk in those woods either. I left the searching up to the police and the local volunteers. But what I can do is ask a question. Does anyone know anything about the old Clickity clackety story? Whew. I don't know what kind of coffee this is, but I need to go get more of it. Something about these new stores down here. They've got a interesting selection of goods that you just don't find in the place where I used to live. Country living, I suppose. It really hits you in different ways sometimes. Coming up next, we have another story by yours truly about another common trope in the woods when it comes to scary stories. So, let's hear some good arguments for why I left the woods.
Yeah, it's just me here tonight, I said as I washed up a few dishes. The darkness outside seemed held at bay by the big floodlight on the pole. The forest surrounding our little cabin looked like a green wave that was preparing to swallow our circle of humanity up forever. And it was only thanks to that 120-watt bulb that we were saved. I had the phone pressed against my ear, and I laughed as my boyfriend said something funny. The phone slipped towards the soapy water, and I caught it just in time as something scratched at the door again. What? Nah, they haven't come home yet. Uncle Ricky doesn't usually like to be out in the woods after dark. I opened the back door as another loud scratch came from it, and Benji walked in. The mutt had been with our family for years, and as he lumbered in, he wagged his tail and gave me a big doggy grin. I wrinkled my nose with disgust when I noticed that he'd been rolling in something. There was red-brown crust all over his right side, and at first I mistook it for blood. When I saw he wasn't limping, though, I figured it was just mud, or worse, blood off of some carcass he'd rolled around in the woods. I started after him as he made his way towards the laundry room where his food bowls were, my boyfriend prattling away in my ear. Rick, I'm gonna have to call you back, I said, making my way towards the laundry room before Benji could roll around on the clean laundry. Everything okay, babe? Yeah, but Benji rolled in something, and I don't want him to get it all over the house. Okay, well, stay safe. Love you. Love you too, Rick. See you tomorrow. I hung up the phone and took a step towards the laundry room. I had just reached for the bristle brush by the sink when my phone blared from the countertop. I turned away from Benji and walked towards the phone, checking the caller ID to see who it was. Brad's smiling face was plastered across the screen, and I picked it up on the third ring. I figured it would be them telling me they were on their way and running late. I didn't get 3 words out, however, before I was immediately buffeted by a wall of static and Brad's frantic voice yelling as he cut in and out. I held the phone a little away from my ear, like it might explode. Hello? Oh God, thank God, Rach. I need you to call the sheriff right now. His tone was equal parts terror and fury, and I was immediately worried. What happened? Is everything okay? Uncle Ricky's hurt pretty bad, and Dad's not in the best shape either. Dad says to call the sheriff and get an ambulance. Lock the door until we get there. Brad, what happened? Do it, Rachel. We'll be there in 5 minutes. Don't open the door for anyone until we get there. Then he hung up on me, and I was left looking at the silent brick. I tried the sheriff's office, but the phone just rang and rang before connecting me with static. The phone number for the ambulance did the same, and by this point, I was starting to get scared. Was there a problem with the phones in town? Had some disaster happened out in the woods that spilled over into town? As I went to lock the door, I saw the familiar headlights of Dad's old pickup coming up the driveway. I flung it open instead and went to help them. Dad came out of the back, hoisting Uncle Ricky under the arm, and Brad hopped out of the driver's seat and ran over to help him. Uncle Ricky hung limply between them, and I could see at a glance that he was not in good shape. His flannel shirt and jeans were covered in blood, and though it was hard to tell, I thought his left arm might be gone. Dad was covered in blood too, but it looked like some of it might be Uncle Rick's. He had 4 long claw marks running through his left eye, and it was swelling too badly for me to tell if the eye still worked. Brad shouted at me to get the door, and I complied as all 3 of them came running into the living room. In the light, it was easy to tell how bad Uncle Rick was. His arm was gone. The sleeve had been used to make a tourniquet around the stump, and his breathing was shallow as he lay on the couch in a state of unconsciousness. Brad said something about getting back for the guns, but Dad shut him down and sent us both to lock the doors. After the house was secure, Dad asked me if I'd called the sheriff or the ambulance. I told him about the strange static, and he swore loudly as he took his own cell phone out of his pocket. He dialed a number, and I could tell by his face that he was getting the same result. Finally, he swore and threw the phone against the wall. "I guess we're on our own," he said, and it was the most hopeless sound I'd ever heard come out of my daddy. Even when Mama died, he'd still kept a strong face on for us. "What's going on? What happened to Uncle Rick?" I asked. Dad looked over at Brad, and after a silent conference, Dad started to tell it. "We'd been hunting for most of the day. We hadn't caught a damn thing. Something was scaring the game off. We heard it walking around a few times and thought it was a bear. Your Uncle Rick said it smelled like a bear. So when the sun started going down, we decided it was time to pack it in. We started getting everything together. Right out of the blue, a doe steps out in the meadow. She looked around real skittish-like and starts cropping grass real quick. She clearly smelled whatever had been making that noise all day, but the deer has to eat, and she started filling her belly as quickly as she could. Your uncle sighted her up and dropped her real easy, and we figured at least we'd have one thing to show for our efforts. No sooner did we get to the edge of the meadow when a big old something comes crashing out. It grabbed our deer and bolted back into the woods like a bat out of hell. It kind of looked like a bear, I guess. The sun was setting and it was hard to tell, but it moved quicker than any bear I'd ever seen. Brad and I were just going to let it go, but Rick was mad as I'd ever seen him. He tore off after it, saying he was going to take that thing home instead. So we follow him, not wanting to leave him in the woods alone after dark, and we chased this thing into its cave. At that point, I was sure it was a bear, so we go creeping in, trying to surprise it. As the sun sets behind us, we see this thing hunkered over the deer, and it weren't no bear. It's wolfing at the deer, just slurping down big mouthfuls, and Rick gets real pale and starts gibbering about how it's the thing that we saw when we were kids. "Wait," I interrupted, you've seen this thing before?" Dad looked perturbed, but nodded. "Yeah, that's why Rick hated to go into the woods after dark. When we were teenagers, we were up in a stand, hunting deer. Rick sights one before sunset, and he drops it, much like we had tonight. We're about to go get it when this big thing comes out of the woods and starts wolfing it down right there in the meadow. Well, you know your Uncle Rick. He always had a temper. So he pops off a shot at it. Hits it too, but that don't do nothing but piss it off. It comes roaring and charging up to the bottom of our tree and starts clawing and pushing until it topples it over. We jump out just as it hits the ground and just go tearing off running for the truck." "And that was what you saw today?" "Well," Dad hedged, "it was almost dark when we shot the deer, and we never got a good look at it. All I know is that's what chased us out of the woods, and Rick wouldn't go hunting with us for the next 3 years after that." He paused for a minute to make sure I was out of questions before continuing his story. "So with Rick gibbering, this thing looks up and sees us. I swear to you that it came up on its hind legs and walked like a man as it ran at us. Rick pops a shot off, probably just panic fire, but it just shrugs it off and lands on him. I saw his arm, rifle and all, go into its mouth, and I heard it crunch as it bit it clean off. Rick starts screaming, and we all start yelling. Before it can finish him off, though, Brad and I pepper it 4 or 5 times with buckshot. It must have dazed it, because it rolled off of Rick with a loud shriek and stumbled back towards the cave. It sounded like a man screaming," Brad said, and Dad nodded before going on. "It starts flailing around in pain, and we grabbed Rick and start dragging him back towards the truck. This thing came after us, and it sounded like it was crashing through the trees the whole way. We couldn't move very fast. Each of us had an arm under Rick as we drug him along, and I swear it would have had us if it hadn't been for Benji." My blood suddenly ran cold. "Benji?" "Yeah, poor little guy. He's been with us the whole time. He didn't seem to want anything to do with that thing, but when it jumped on us again and raked my face, he started growling and lunges right at it. I hear them tearing and snarling at each other, and we just hightailed it back to the truck. It's a wonder we ever found it in the dark. Poor old Benji. He sacrificed himself so we could get away." Both Brad My dad looked forlorn, but I just shook my head. No, he didn't. He's right here. Dad gave me a funny look. What are you talking about? He came wandering in not long before you guys did. That's when I remembered the blood on his fur. There was no way he could outrun the truck. Hell, the only reason I hadn't questioned it was because I had forgotten he had gone with him. I looked back towards the kitchen door, and it creaked open as Benji's friendly grin poked through the gap. He strolled into the living room, his fur still a mess of blood and mud, and glanced around the room as his tail wagged and his big old doggy smile stretched across his face. When he stepped up on his hind legs, I thought for sure I was dreaming. Benji leapt across the living room, and when he hit the couch, he was no longer the cuddly mutt we'd all come to love. He was 200 pounds of sleek black fur and raking claws that reduced my family to a spray of blood and screams of mercy. I fell back from the scene, covering my eyes with my hands to block it all out. I could still hear every bone-wrenching yank, every blood-splattering swipe, and every watery gurgle as my family had their throats torn out. I was numb. My mind shrank away from the scene before me as I backpedaled until my back hit the wall of the cabin. I curled my knees up to my chest and put my head against my knees as I sank to the floor and waited for it to be over. I didn't care at that moment whether I lived or died. I only wanted it to end. I could feel myself crying as the living room became a killing field. And when it finally ended, I could hear the overpowering bray of my explosive sobs. My sobs stopped when I heard heavy footsteps walking towards me. I didn't look up. I didn't want to look up. But when the creature's hot breath puffed against the top of my head, I pulled my face away from my knees despite myself. His blood-smeared face was inches from mine, and I quickly buried my face against my knees again. It was leaning over me, my family's blood pattering onto my skin, and it was all I could do not to pass out from terror. We stayed like that for several minutes, until I couldn't take it anymore. I lifted my head and looked at this semi-feline face and asked the question, Why haven't you killed me yet? His voice was high, like a bee that's been caught in a jar, and it hurt my ears to listen to him. Because you helped me. For that favor, I will give you a favor in return. Leave my woods before sunset tomorrow, and I will allow you to continue to exist. Stay, and you will share the fate of your kin. Then he turned and walked out of the house on 2 legs. I was gone before the sun came up. I threw my clothes in a bag, took the pickup my brother had been careless enough to leave the keys in, and drove. My phone rang a few times, but I ignored it. The hardest was when Aunt Clara called, but after 3 days, even she stopped calling. They likely assumed I was dead too. I sold the truck before I left the state and haven't looked back. I drove until I couldn't see the forest anymore. I drove until I couldn't see 3 trees grouped close enough to obscure anything. And when the desert stretched out before me, I finally stopped. I'll make my life here now. I have no intention of ever leaving the desert again. I don't know what forest this creature calls its own, and I never want to find out.
One more story for you, and I promise this one is a doozy. Talks about an impromptu camping trip that maybe goes a little different than the 2 boys expected. Written by Indefinite Silence, let's hear a little tale about a local oddity called Hangman Hill. Gaston, South Carolina, is a lonely little place. Sitting just south of Columbia, along 321, it's only a small crumb off the misshapen piece of pie on the United States plate that we call South Carolina. Its population has almost never gone over 2,000, and it's only 3.4 square miles across in all directions. It feels even lonelier when you come in from a place like Roanoke, Virginia. After Mom lost her job, we moved to the only place where the rest of our family resided. Good old South Kakalaki. I had been moping the whole time on the way down. The way I saw it, the only friend I was going to be making here were the fire ants and the inferno of a sun. Once we got settled in at 304 Dixonia Drive, I always remembered the address because the numbers in it was carved into the driveway, and it spelled hoe if you looked at it upside down. I immediately set out into the neighborhood in search of friends. I didn't know how to ride a bike at the time, and I barely knew how to ride a skateboard, so I petered down a long stretch of road directly across from the front of the house on my cheap little Walmart board until I came to a cul-de-sac that seemed to go uphill. Sitting outside on his front porch was a chubby kid with glasses that looked about 10 or 11, about my age at the time. I really had no one to talk to, so I asked what his name was. Terry, he told me. He liked being outside a lot, and I didn't, but we both seemed to enjoy video games. With that, we got along just fine. There was one thing that he hadn't told me over the next few weeks that we spent riding along the neighborhood. He was into scary stories. I was a massive chicken when it came to anything that seemed intent on forcing me to change my underwear every few minutes, so I didn't really like that aspect of him. Even worse, he had tons of horror movie action figures and loads of VHS tapes of all the classic creepy movies you can think of, stocked in his room. Every time I came to visit, he was almost certain to scare the bejesus out of me with one of those creepy Freddy Krueger dolls, or force me to watch the Texas Chainsaw Massacre with him in the dark. The room wasn't really that nice looking to begin with. He had a bunk bed. He was an only child, and just his grandmother lived with him, in which he slept on the bottom, and all of his slasher flicks and action figures slept on the top. There were loads of holes in the wall, and everything had a general grimy feel to it. It made those horrifying moments of watching pure terror in the dark a lot more icky. One day, when he realized that I pretty much hated any kind of horror movie he threw at me, he began telling me urban legends. Some of them were about the town as a whole, but more often than not, they were about our particular neighborhood. I didn't really believe any of them. That is, until he told me about Hangman Hill. It was about a year after we had met each other. We were riding around the neighborhood. By this time, Terry had told me to man up and eventually taught me how to ride a bike. He stopped when we were riding in front of a house that he had simply entitled the Crack Shack, due to its residents being stoned out of their minds on a regular basis. He seemed to be peering out at a small pathway behind the place that sloped up the farthest part where you went back. He was usually the leader when it came to showing me new places in the neighborhood, but I didn't question a thing when he beckoned for me to follow him up the trail. It was a pretty steep climb up the side of the hill, with plenty of sand and rocks to send anyone not being careful straight back down again. It felt as though the trees were closing tighter and tighter on us until we reached a large opening at the top. Besides the empty soda bottles and used condoms, the only man-made thing in the area that could be seen were long stretches of telephone poles going across a series of sandy, dry hills. If not for the two stripes of heavy forest on either side of those hills, it might have gone on forever. The area didn't seem to have any particular importance. I'd expected him to bring me to some awful cemetery, but in the dying light of the late afternoon sky, those rolling hills looked beautiful. I thought that he might be trying some desperate last attempt to scare me. but instead, he just turned to me with the most serious and grim face I'd ever seen. "Here we are. Hangman Hill," he said. "Hangman Hill? Is this another one of your stories?" "Sort of, except this one's true." I rolled my eyes at the thought. How did he possibly expect me to believe any of his tales? He just kept staring at me with that face, waiting for me to respond. How could this even be a Hangman Hill? There's no hanging man, and there's at least 6 hills around here. Right down there. Look. He pointed his finger towards the nearest telephone pole. Sitting between the 2 closest hills to us, a small creek, no more than about 5 feet across, ran between the 2 hills and went onward into a never-ending forest. There were no hanging men, but the pole itself seemed more ominous than the rest. "Roy Terrence," he whispered. "Who? It wouldn't be Hangman Hill without a hanging man, would it?" He bolted down the first hill on that blazing orange bike of his. I tried to keep up, but Walmart and sporting goods don't seem to mix. There was a faulty chain on my cheap, dull red bike. The sticks from the surrounding trees had rooted themselves to the ground, and they were now snagging on the dangling chain. With one mighty tug of a huge root on the bike, I was head over handlebars all the way to the bottom. I landed on my knees with a small sploosh sound as my leg hit the water. It couldn't have been more than a few inches deep. I almost called for help from Terry when I realized that he had stopped at the bottom just before I had tumbled to the creek alongside him. His head was peering upward, looking straight at the top of that dark and shadowy-looking telephone pole. "Little help," I squeaked. Terry broke his gaze from the pole just long enough to wrench me from the creek and get me on my feet. After that, his stare continued to be fixed on the seeming nothing at the top of the pole for a long time. "What is it, or who is it that you're looking for again?" I grumbled in frustration. I was going to be pretty pissed if he'd taken me down here, and all I had gotten for the trip was banged up knees. I hadn't noticed the pain before because the water in the stream was cool, but now it stung like the dickens. "Roy Terrence, owner of that small shed just beyond the trees over there." I hadn't noticed the shed. It sat just behind a large oak. It couldn't have been bigger than 5 outhouses put together, maybe. After his wife and kids left him, he hung himself from all those wires just above us. Cops didn't find much, just a charred husk of what used to be a man. Legend says that whoever is out here at this exact time of death gets strung up on the wires with him. Oh, and do tell, when would that be? For once, he broke his serious tone and gave me a goofy, "I don't know," shrug, and then he was back to that grim attitude. "And you're suggesting that we stay here and wait for him, despite the many excuses I have to dispute this. I think I'm going to go home. It's late, and my mom is making dinner, so I gotta get." "Fine, tell your mom that you're sleeping over at my house tomorrow night, though, and I'll do vice versa with my grandma. Meet me here at 7. Against my better judgment, I decided that I might as well go. What harm could it do? Obviously, he was lying, and if nothing else, it would set my mind at ease to see that he was indeed lying. While none of his stories actually seemed to be true up until this point, his sudden change of tone had made this one sound slightly more believable. When Terry had told his other stories, he was giggling so hard that you might have thought he had snorted a half a pound of crack. When we were heading home, just as the last tin of orange left the sky, I asked him, "Why'd you get so serious back there? You're always such a total goofball." "I lost my grandpa," to Roy Terrence. "My grandma was with him when it happened. Haven't you ever wondered why she's so grumpy all the time?" His grandmother was in fact very crotchety. I'd never bothered to ask why she was that way. If this was all some elaborate hoax by Terry, I was going to slap him next Thursday when it was done. That night, I had a horrible nightmare. Like most people, I couldn't remember much about it, but in it, Roy Terrence was written large across it. Even though it was roasting on that hot South Carolina night, I'd woken up with the chills. By the time 6 p.m. had rolled around, I had already packed my old school bag with basic equipment like a flashlight and a few bags of Chex Mix, in case I got hungry. By 6:30, I'd rolled into the neighborhood as fast as I could. I had to admit I was actually kind of excited. Finally, at around 6:55, I arrived at the small creek, where Terry had already set up a small fire and was roasting marshmallows. If I hadn't decided to show up, I would have disappointed him like hell. How is this going to work out exactly? Are we just going to camp out here until night? We don't know when he's supposed to show up. Terry had stuffed his face with marshmallows. What? He crammed the marshmallow down his throat. I said, I'll wait here all night if I have to. Whatever, I retorted, as I popped down next to the fire. He'd thrown 3 lighters in to keep it lit, and began to pull out my snacks. After about 3 hours, the first of the crickets began to sing their endless chirping song, as the last streak of sun had reached its end. I had begun to grow irritated, and a little bit tired. Terry was wide awake, his hands glued to the bag of marshmallows. He had started his eternal gaze at the top of the pole again. Terry, man, I'm tired. If I don't see a crispy dead dude in the next hour, I'm out. Okay. His cheeks were stuck out like a squirrel's with another marshmallow. I snuggled up against the fire and began to doze off. Just as I was about to slip into unconsciousness, a loud, crusty, brittle peeling sound echoed through the hills and out into the forest. I immediately sat up. My vision was pretty blurred from having almost dozed off, but I could make out Terry's shape. He was gagging, wide-eyed, at the top of the pole. If there had been a bit of moonlight, I might have been able to see for sure what he had seen up there, but the crescent moon sat just beyond the trees like the shed. In an instant, Terry was on his bike and flying up the hill, bag of marshmallows in hand. I managed to pull myself up and get to my bike. I began pedaling like a madman before I realized that my chain had popped off. Stupid damn bike. With my eyes adjusted to the dark, I peered back at the top of the pole one more time before I bolted to the top of the hill. Roy Terrence was not so much a person as he was a sagging shape. His flesh, dark as the night, was clinging to his bones for dear life. His facial features, though not entirely evident, seemed to be in a constant state of agony and ecstasy. And that eye, that one eye he had left deep in his socket, gazed upon me with absolute hatred and an insatiable want. Just when it seemed that he was ready to climb off that wire and come for me, the weak spine that had been holding his head so that molten pile of flesh and bones sagged, sending what was left of his skull tumbling into the fire Terry had started. It gave me one glowing, burning, satisfied grin before disintegrating into a wisp of ash. I had been halfway up the hill before I had realized I was moving, following the bike track Terry had left, which led further into the hills instead of to the other side, where the trail led back to the neighborhood. Just as I clawed my way to the top of the hill, I saw a thin shape dangling from above. "Oh no," I croaked. Terry's bike, that blazing orange bike that he loved so much, was left wrecked at the base of a telephone pole. Above, Terry's body hung limply, though it didn't look much like Terry anymore. Terry hadn't been on the wire as long as Roy, which made it even worse. He was charred, but not entirely. His eyes bulged from his head in a constant shock. What was left of his hair stood out on the end, still smoking. The seemingly endless wire above entangled Terry's neck like a boa constrictor. Dangling from his scrawny, burnt left arm was a bag of marshmallows, melted to his hand from the heat. The police investigation didn't dig up much. They scoured all throughout the area, and they found no evidence that anyone else was there. I begged them to search the telephone wire, but they continued to state that there was no evidence that anyone had even touched the wires. The search continued for 3 weeks. After that, the police finally gave up. Terry's grandmother passed away. For those last few days, she hadn't said anything to anyone at all. She only sat and stared at the picture of her and her husband for the remainder of her life. After the house had been cleaned out, the contents of Terry's room were offered to me. His entire collection of horror movies, action figures, and all else was donated to Goodwill, at my request. I went back a few years later. We had gone to Gaston to visit with our family for a while, and I had requested that we stop by the old neighborhood. Any evidence that we had ever been there in those fateful days had been swept away by police or the weather. Now, like before, there was only useless garbage and telephone poles. Just as I was getting ready to walk away, I caught a glimpse of something out of the corner of my eye. I only saw a tiny bit of it before it fluttered away. It was a melted marshmallow bag. And just like that, our stories are at an end, yet again. But don't feel too bad. There'll be lots more cozy horror to come as you sit around a fire with me and listen to me tell great stories by great writers. Until then, this is Dr. Plague, wishing you a wonderful day and a spooky evening.